What is the biggest thing that I see going wrong with test automation code when I review code from testers that I work with? I want to explain what the biggest flaw I see is and what you can do to fix it. My name's John Ferguson Smart and I help testers become awesome test automation engineers. In these videos, I want to give you actionable tips that can help you improve your test automation code and your test automation career. Now, the problem that I want to talk about is how you use inheritance in test automation code. Inheritance is one of the most well-known object-oriented patterns, probably because it's relatively easy to understand. A car is a type of motor vehicle, so it inherits some of the attributes of the vehicle, for example, having an engine. But it also has some attributes of its own, for example, having wheels and a steering wheel. Now, inheritance is a useful tool. It's mainly useful for two things: to avoid duplication and to implement polymorphism. Polymorphism is when you define an abstract method in an abstract class and then, for instance, drive in a vehicle, and then you implement that method differently for different child classes. So bicycle will have a different drive method to car, for example. And that is a very useful pattern. But it's a very specific pattern. And what I see in test automation code is that generally people don't really use inheritance that way. They use it simply to share code across multiple tests. And what happens is that people tend to use inheritance way too much. I'll give you an example. Imagine you're writing some cucumber step definition classes where all of the steps in different classes need to say call an API. Okay, that's great. You say, awesome. Let's create a parent class for all of the step definition classes and we'll put our API logic in this parent class. So far, so good. Then they find that some of the steps also need to make database queries. So they put the database logic in this parent class as well. And then, guess what? Some of the steps need to do UI testing, so they put the Selenium WebDriver setup and teardown logic in the parent class as well. And before long, what happens is the parent class is packed full of API logic, database logic, WebDriver logic, and a whole lot of other stuff that they decided they needed to share between the steps. And what this means is that you have this big, massive, hard to understand parent class, which is also very hard to maintain, because if you want to change the parent class because the test needs something, the chances are it may affect lots of other tests. So your test suite becomes very fragile. In short, inheritance is a great pattern for very specific needs, but as a general purpose use of sharing stuff between classes, it tends to lead to very messy code. Now, developers have discovered this have known this for quite a while and are moving to other strategies. But in test automation, we still see inheritance as the main way of sharing logic between codes, and that's a shame. So what is this better way? What is this better solution that developers know about that test automation engineers seem to have neglected? Simple. It's called composition. Composition is when you define dedicated classes to do a job, and then you use these classes in different places. It's a much more flexible way of sharing code than inheritance. So, for example, let's take our API example. If you use composition, you would have a separate dedicated class that looks after API logic and does all the API calls. And then you have another different class for your database queries, and then you have another different class that handles API calls, for example. And in your test code, your step definitions, you would invoke those different objects. You would use those objects when you need them. So it becomes much cleaner, much clearer, much easier to understand, much more focused, and also easier to maintain because each class does a specific job and you don't have to worry about breaking someone else's test because you update a particular bit of logic in your API code, for example. So in short, if you want to make your test automation code cleaner, clearer, easier to maintain, do what developers have been doing for decades and use composition rather than inheritance by default. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening.